Okay, welcome everyone to OFC203. Our session here is on SharePoint and workflow. When I say welcome, I mean a very big welcome. For those of you who don't know, not only is this session being presented for you all here in Orlando, but we're also being simulcast over live meetings, so around the internet. For me, it's almost like being on live TV, so hi, Mom. My name is Ed Hild. This is Alex Starykh. We work at the Microsoft Technology Center in Reston, Virginia, which is just outside of Washington, D.C. It's our job, our daily job, in fact, to work with customers to help them apply Microsoft technologies to their business problems. And we do that through a couple different types of engagements, typically architecture design sessions or proof of concept. So with this session, we're really focused on how do you take what's in these products and make them actually do what you need them to do in your organization. One of the things that we ask, since we are being simulcast in such a large group, is that if you have questions, please hold them to the end. And when we do get to the Q&A period, please step up to the microphone. I'll remind you about that again, just so that your questions as well can be heard over the live meeting webcast. No pressure. So for our session, in terms of the agenda, we're going to go through an overview of Windows Workflow Foundation and get into some detail about how it's implemented in SharePoint. We're going to look at the out-of-the-box workflows, what comes when you take the CD and install it on the server, and not only what's there, but then how through configuration you can tune it for specific business processes. So even if it's not a close match, sometimes without having to get down and write code, you can make it able to automate your process. From that, we'll start building some custom workflows and focus on how to select the right tool for the right job. Lastly, a few tidbits just around workflow administration, reporting, and those types of things.
Hey Ed, we got workflow in every single bullet point here. So what is it a workflow anyway?
So thank you for the somewhat leading question. So it's a common question that we get asked with customers, and in fact, it's not unusual for us to be talking and everyone around the room, and everyone has a different interpretation of what that word workflow means. It's kind of like the term portal was a few years ago and maybe even now. So when we're talking about workflow, or you need to have a conversation with customers about workflow, here's a nice, easy definition. Break it up into two pieces, work and flow. Work is just activity towards a goal. A bunch of people doing stuff that have some end goal in sight. The flow is the course that they take to that end point. So with that definition, you can break down and start to talk about different categories of workflow. And we have here a diagram that kind of gives you that whole spectrum. On one hand, there's the collaborative processes that are usually individual-driven, very ad hoc, where you don't know up front what number of steps or how it's going to go from user to user. All you know is, eventually the document needs to get approved. At the other end of the spectrum are transactional-based workflow processes. And in this type of workflow, you are looking at moving data between systems, line of business applications, where you're concerned about transforming that data, transactional boundaries, all of those types of things. So there are some other areas in between, but this spectrum is also one that is illustrated in Microsoft's technology stack. So on the collaborative processes side is more of the SharePoint Office-based solutions. If you're dealing with a problem that's highly transactional, or to the right end of that spectrum, BizTalk server is more appropriate. Right? The gray area in between is usually a combination of them both. So Windows Workflow Foundation. Sometime last year, at the end of last year, sometimes I get lost in terms of time, but towards the end of last year, we released the .NET Framework 3.0. There were several key components to that framework, one of which was Windows Workflow Foundation, WF is the acronym. Notice we did not select WWF. That one was already taken. The trivia question, of course, is by who? It's not the wrestling group you're thinking of. They changed their name. It's the World Wildlife Foundation. Right? So Windows Workflow Foundation, WF. What's nice about this, since it's part of the framework, the goal here is to be able to provide developers with a component that's going to give them a consistent way of building programs that need workflow services. Right? So a consistent model. For the developer, this means consistent tools, a consistent API, a consistent engine.
So Ed, we actually happen to be running in the Office track. How all of it relates to Office?
Yeah. So it turns out that people who build documents also want workflow processes. So how many of you, by raise of hand, have had a document, you needed to collect feedback from, say, 10 other of your team members, you've done probably the worst action possible, add it as an email attachment, and send it out? All right, I thought this was a SharePoint track. You could have stored it in a SharePoint library. Right? So, no, but even if you're sending it out, it should invoke the horror for your users, and especially your end users, that now everyone has a copy of that. They're making changes. They're submitting feedback to you. Your poor soul, especially if it was 25, 50 users that are giving feedback, are having to correlate all the changes, update the document, send out updates. And of course, people aren't checking their email quite regularly, so you have lots of different versions that people are sending you stuff back. And it should be a complete nightmare, not to mention eventually your mail server administrator will start knocking on your door. So with the release of Office 2007, we took that Windows workflow foundation that we made available for developers and used it ourselves. Right? So with Office, we're focused on document-centric workflows, much like what I just described. We want to make sure that as we deliver this solution that for the end user, we don't take them out of the tools that they're already familiar with. So when they interact with the workflow, they're going to stay inside that Office environment. And that's depicted on the other half of this slide. So if the user is working on a document that's part of a workflow, they're going to get notified directly within Word, PowerPoint, Excel. They're going to see that workflow, that they have a task to do, and be able to complete that task without leaving the application. If the workflow needs to notify them or assign them a task, the workflow is going to deliver that through Outlook. In terms of starting workflows, reporting on them, tracking them, all those will be done via SharePoint. And we have a new tool, SharePoint Designer, which is going to be a tool we'll see in a bit later for customizing and building your own workflows.
So to be more specific, what is it I am getting with the Office? Yeah,
so you install the CD, you set everything up, what do you get out of the box? Right, that's the question?
Yeah.
So here's a list of your workflow templates that are in SharePoint. And I'll go through them briefly, and of course you can refer back to the slide afterwards. The approval workflow is exactly the scenario I asked you earlier. So everyone raised their hand. So you buy this product, it automates that. The approval workflow, you have that document, you want to send it out. There's a sequence of people who are going to approve it. You can do them one at a time. That's what serial represents. So I'm going to ask person A. After they approve it, I'm going to ask person B, and so forth. Or parallel, where I'm sending it out to everyone, and I'm waiting for a certain amount of yes or no votes. The collect feedback workflow is subtly different. In that one, we're not only asking for approval, kind of a yes-no action. There's a sense of collecting feedback from users and then aggregating that together for the person who started the workflow. The collect signatures workflow is also an out-of-the-box workflow, and it ties into a digital signature infrastructure so that as the document gets routed amongst the individuals, they can electronically sign it. The disposition approval workflow is one that usually people usually associate this with records management and the records center within MOS. It's very focused for when you are expiring content. You want to keep something for 7 years. That time period has arrived. What do you want to do now? Not too many organizations automatically delete things, right, which is one of the settings. So there's a disposition approval workflow for what do we want to do? Is it archived to another storage? Do we notify an administrator? We automatically get rid of it, whatever. The group approval workflow is one that is prevalent or supports workflows that are prevalent in some of the Asian cultures. So you only see this in a few languages, but it's an organizational hierarchy-based approval process. Translation management is one that's pretty particular to MOS and SharePoint in that it helps support the web content management functionality. So if you've attended any of those sessions, you've heard that web content management's the old CMS functionality, content management server, and it's geared around people maintaining HTML content in a page. Well, translation management deals with, well, what if that site's multilingual? And we have different variations. So the page is not only in English, it's also in Spanish and Japanese. Right? So when a change is made to the English site, it automatically triggers the update to the other users that maintain the other languages. Now, it doesn't automatically translate it to those languages. You'd have to plug in some type of service or third-party component if you wanted to do that. And last but not least, the three-state workflow. This one's almost so generic, it's kind of hard to describe. Basically, imagine moving a document among one of three statuses, one of three states. Right? People tend to think of that as pending, approved, and rejected, but it doesn't have to be that. It could be any choice column that you have that has three values. So if you're going to move that document through that process. If you notice on the slide, there's a very important point about that workflow, is it's the only workflow template that is in Windows SharePoint Services. The others require you to have MOS, the Microsoft Office SharePoint Server. So I'm anticipating another question.
No, I'm good.
No, you're good. Okay, thank you. So let's switch screens and jump into our first demo and take a look at what you can do with the out-of-the-box workflows. Switch over to my laptop. And for this, no custom code, a little bit of configuration, and I'll show you the configuration as well. So let's split the demo into two halves. With the first piece, we're going to see end users interacting with the workflow that I've built. And to kind of give you a little bit of a story, and you see that a little bit of a story, this is a workflow that's focused on a user who's creating interview guidelines for her company, and she needs to send it through its approval process she's done. And in her org, that process is already set up with an out-of-the-box workflow to go through two people. So it starts with Jane, it goes to Bob, and then it goes to Stacy for final approval. Sound good? All right. So let's start with Jane. I have a normal SharePoint team site here. Welcome, Jane. So I'll go into the shared document library, upload my file. So here's my interview guidelines. And then I can access that via the web interface right here just by clicking the drop-down, going to the Workflows tab. And it's going to show me the workflows that are available for this document. We'll talk about how these get here in just a second. So I'm going to launch the interview guidelines approval. With the workflow started, the very first thing it's going to do is ask me for some input parameters for that workflow. How many days is it going to take to launch? How many days am I going to expect users to get back to me? Any other kind of message? Do I want to CC others? And notice with the way this workflow is configured, that as Jane, I don't have the ability to change who it goes through. This is an option we'll show you how to configure later. But it's already set up. It's going to go to Bob, then it's going to go to Stacy, and the workflow is sequential. So it'll do one and then the other. I could customize the message. I could change the number of days. But really what I want to do is click Start. So this will start the workflow process. And step one is for Bob to come and take a look at the document. Agreed? So notice that there's a new column that's been added to the view here. It's the name of the workflow, and it shows that it's in progress. Right? So as Jane, I could click on that and take a look at it right away, just to give you a clue that already Bob's been assigned a task within SharePoint. And there's a little bit of a history list going on here that we'll come back to later. She also, if you saw it pop up on the screen very quickly, got an email notification saying it has started, and it's going to go to Bob, and then it's going to go to Stacy. So let's switch gears and become Bob. So welcome, Bob. Let's do a quick send receive here. Now, it does take a little bit of time for my email to get delivered, so we won't wait for the email. We'll just keep going. So if I go to my calendar and look on Saturday, which is 3 days from today, the due date of when this task needs to be, it's already there in Outlook. Right? This is because not only would I receive the email notification telling me that I have work to do, Outlook is also examining the tasks list of that website and pulling that information down. So finally, for those of you who've used SharePoint 2003, the tasks that you create, the users get as real Outlook tasks. It's not email that they're going to have to keep around. So I get the task directly within here. It's showing up in my calendar for when it's due. I can open up the task. It says it was assigned by Jane, due on a particular time. I'm not going to really edit the task at this point because as Bob, the first thing I do is take a look at the document. So this takes me right to the document. Now you'll notice when Word opens, if you've not seen this before, I get the new business bar, which is that workflow task item within Word telling me that this document's participating in a workflow and that I have a task assigned. So Bob's asked to review it. He's going to scroll down, take a look at it, and in particular, in terms of the instructions for conducting the interview, it mentions something here about a tape recorder. Bob doesn't like that. That's old policy. We're not going to audio tape all of our interviews. So he's going to ask Jane to correct that before he signs off on it. Now, this is an important step because when we defined the workflow, we defined it as 3 steps. Jane was going to start it. It was going to go to Bob, and then it was going to go to Stacy. Yet Bob, looking at this, wants to change that process. Right? He's saying, well, no, I don't want to approve it yet. I might want to send it to another user or delegate that task, or I want to send it back to Jane. So that's the ad hocness that I was mentioning earlier in that spectrum. We knew up front about what that process would be, but not necessarily the perfect path through it every time. So I can go ahead and make that declaration here. So if I pull up this task to open it up, notice the 2 options here at the bottom. Reassigning the task, which would be the delegation path, or the ability to request a change. So in this case, I'm going to click the request a change link. Who do I want the change to come from? Another user. In this case, it makes more sense to send it back to Jane. So let's ask her not to review this document, but instead, we don't use a tape recorder. And by the way, fix this like right now. Let's go ahead and make it today. And click send. Notice that the workflow details are being sent back to the server. Once the task has been completed, the business bar, that little workflow icon, goes away. Let's go ahead and close this. So Bob sent it to, or Jane sent it to Bob. Bob sent it back. Let's go back to Jane. Do a real quick send receive here. And we can see that the emails are coming in, so I wasn't lying earlier. The email service does work. So there's the task being assigned to Jane Doe in this case, but her task was due today, right? So again, full integration into the Outlook client. Not only does it show up in your tasks list and along with your calendar, if it's something that's due today, it's going to be in your to-do bar. So it's the Outlook 2007 way of going in, viewing your tasks that you have. And I could go in, say, well, I have that task, so let me go ahead and open up the document. In this case, I need to make the change to the file, so let's go ahead and edit it. Go back, and we'll just delete this item. Yeah, we don't tape record people anymore. Click Save to save it back to the site. And then I'll notify that my task is done. We'll go ahead and close this. So hopefully I haven't confused you yet in terms of all the options, but I kind of need a demo that's something more than one step, right? So we go back to Bob just to show you a little bit of variety here. It doesn't have to be something that is completely integrated into the thick client, the Word document that you see that I'm interacting with. This would be especially true if you were working with an organization that wasn't going to roll out the Word 2007 or the Outlook 2007 very quickly, right? So you would still get the email as an action, but then the users, instead of launching the editing of the task from the client applications, they'd be able to do so from the web interface. So on this website, you can see that not only do I have the documents web part there, but also the tasks web part. So Bob is seeing that he has a task assigned, so he can go in and edit it directly from the web interface, and it's the same experience. So he can say, looks good. Go ahead and click Approve. Now there is one last step here that I did that I didn't foreshadow very well. So let me go back and just click here for a second. Notice that it still says it's in progress because Stacy hasn't approved it yet, right? She was the last one in that chain. But the document here is still set as pending, right? This is not a workflow attribute. This is an attribute of the library. It's very similar to versioning, where when you turn on versioning, you have version 1, version 2, version 2.1, 2.2 in MOS. Back in the old SharePoint 2003 days where we only had one-step approval, there was this concept of pending documents and approved documents. And what that meant is when a document was pending, only users who had edit rights to that content could see that file, and people who are just readers of the site have no idea that any of this activity is going on. So that's an important step here because when Stacy finally signs off on it, it's going to switch that document attribute from pending to approved, meaning that now the workflow has completed and that file, without moving, right, is going to be made available to just general readers of the site. So last but not least, let's become Stacy. So she'll go in. Oh, she needs her task, sorry, not her document. So there's her task. Just say done and click approve. So her task will be updated. The workflow has been complete. If we go to share the documents now, notice that pending now says approved. And if I click on the workflow itself also completed, which is returning back a status of approved. And if I go into this, you see there's a lot of history here going on. And again, we'll come back and look at this in more detail. So when we're talking about out-of-the-box workflows and document-centric workflows, these are the types of things we're talking about, right? And I'm showing you a variety of using the web-based experience as well as the thick client, Office, and Outlook 2007. So how was this set up? We log in as an administrator. So this would be the other half of the demo. How did that workflow become available for Jane to start right away? Well, it is an out-of-the-box workflow, and I associated it with the library itself. So if I go into the document library settings and click on workflow, notice that there is one interview guidelines approval workflow that's available. Let's see what the experience is like when I add a workflow. And in this case, I'll try to build one that's identical to the one that I just walked through. So the same options of switching pending to approved, as well as locking down the user list that Jane had to pick from. So here's where I select what workflow template that I like. I can reuse approval. In this case, I'll give a name of legal review. And let's just because I might have used it before. Every workflow in SharePoint takes advantage of a task list and a history list. And in this case, what I wanted to do is have a dedicated task list and a dedicated history list for this particular workflow. From a reporting standpoint, having this thing separate usually is a lot easier. It's not a limitation. You saw I could select one that already exists. Here are my options for how the workflow should start. Do I want the workflow to be started automatically? And that can happen when a new item is added or changed. Or do I want just to let the user to be able to choose to start it? So the demo I did earlier, Jane added the document and then she started the workflow. So in this case, I'm going to leave it manual. Here are a few configuration options for the approval workflow specifically. In this case, this is where you choose from a setup as to whether this approval process is serial or parallel. Again, the parallel one means that I'm going to send it out to a group and wait for a certain number of responses. If it's serial, I'm going to ask the users in sequence. So since I asked Bob and then Stacy, I'm going to leave it serial. If you want to disable the options for delegation, that reassigning, or if you want to disable the ability for a user to request a change before completing the task, those are the checkboxes there that control those options that you saw that Bob had while within Word. So for approvers, we'll go in and specify Bob was my first user. So go ahead and add Bob, and then add Stacy. When you're doing a workflow where the users are going to be asked in sequence, this order is very important, right? It's the order that's going to dictate how they're going to get notified, right? So in this case, Bob will be asked before Stacy because that's the way I added them in this interface. Below here is allow changes to the participant list. So this is typically left on, especially in most ad hoc scenarios where the users who it might go to might be different every time. But I just wanted to show you the flexibility of turning that off, in which case removing that option from the user when they start the workflow. I could then provide default values for the message. Please look at me. And a default value for the number of days to give each user. The CC others would just be informing other people that the workflow process is going on. And then I have some completion steps, and these can be a little confusing. Are there ways that the workflow might otherwise be canceled? Typically, the workflow stops when all the users have completed their tasks. Right? If something else should happen, then I want that workflow to stop regardless of what the user's done. That's what these checkboxes here are for. So document is rejected. If someone went in and set that pending approved bit to rejected directly, then I might cancel the workflow. If I want to make sure that the document remains unchanged during the approval process, right? So I would want to check the box here that, if the document gets changed, cancel that workflow and make them start it again. Right? The last checkbox here is the one that I showed you for that versioning attribute of when the document was first added and it went from pending and then to approved. That's going to have the workflow set it to approved for me upon completion of all the tasks. So that's just an example of an out-of-the-box workflow, users interacting with it, and then how, as an administrator, site administrator, or list owner, you could go in and define one of those associations and tune that particular workflow template to your process. So if this is what end users see, how about under the hood? Right? Alex, can you walk us through what happens or how Windows Workflow Foundation is taken advantage of by SharePoint?
Sure. So let's talk about Windows Workflow architecture in general. First thing to remember is that Windows Workflow architecture is actually built around hosted model. That implies that workflows do not exist on their own. There is always a host application that supports every single workflow. The core piece to the workflow foundation is the workflow runtime engine. Workflow runtime engine is responsible for managing the lifetime of the workflow. It ensures that workflow runs. It ensures that it stays in memory for as long as necessary or stays active. Well, the runtime engine doesn't do it alone. It relies on a set of runtime services. Every single host application can decide what implementation of each service to use. In fact, those services are pluggable, so custom application might decide to use a custom implementation of a specific service. Well, we ship Workflow Foundation with a lot of different activities. And activities include if, then conditions, let's say different loops, different policy exceptions. There are a lot of different out-of-box activities we supply with Workflow Foundation by default. In addition, you're quite welcome to create your own custom activities. Well, and of course, on top of it, we have a complete support for Workflow Designer. In fact, for Visual Studio.net, we have a special add-on package, or just a download, that you can use to install workflow extensions for Visual Studio. In addition, you're quite welcome to use custom designers, build your own designers. In fact, as we'll see in a few minutes, SharePoint Designer is one example of such kind of custom designer built on top of that architecture.
So, Alex, you picked on me earlier that we need to stay Office focused, right? So if this is workflow in general, how does SharePoint take advantage of it?
Yep. So let's take a look at what is happening inside of SharePoint. Windows SharePoint Services is actually a host for Workflow Foundation. In fact, the runtime engine for workflow is hosted inside of WSS worker process. WSS provides implementation for all necessary services for the Workflow Foundation. For example, the persistent service. That is one of the most interesting services in Workflow Foundation. Workflow runtime engine works very, very closely with that persistence service to ensure that we have a very effective and efficient memory management. Human workflows tend to be idle a lot of time. Maybe workflow is idle because it is waiting for an approval or for completion of a specific task. Well, if that happens, workflow is idle and it does not make sense to keep that workflow in memory. So what we do, we dehydrate that workflow and we pass that information to the persistence service. And persistence service takes a complete state of that workflow and saves it to a database. So workflow is not longer in the memory. When the task, let's say a task is complete, workflow host will know that the actual workflow has been dehydrated. So it's time to wake it up and continue from the last point. So that allows us to scale quite well and again, very, very efficient be quite efficient with memory and other resources. Well, notification service, as you probably already noticed, notifications service is all about task management. Usually when workflow needs to notify a user, it is done via task. What about roles? As you probably know, in WSS, you can use your custom role provider. By default, we rely on Active Directory, but we don't have to. You're quite welcome to plug in your own custom providers. Well, Workflow Foundation will use that provider as well. Tracking. Tracking is actually done via history list. It is just a simple list, nothing, no special customization is necessary for that list. And as workflow is executed, we log some information to that list. You have an option of deciding if you would like to use a single history list or multiple different lists for different workflows. And of course, in the SharePoint SDK, we ship SharePoint SDK with a lot of SharePoint activity libraries. Those activities that sit in that library allows you to build your own custom workflows and do whatever you like to do in them. So those activities include, let's say, create a task, wait for task completion, send email. Most of those activities are specific to SharePoint, so you can get them in the SharePoint SDK. And of course, a complete support for workflow object model is built in the product as well. So if there is only one piece of information you will take out of this session, let it be what is depicted here on this slide. We are talking about the relationship between workflow templates, associations, and items. What is a workflow template anyway? Workflow template is actually an XML file that contains a pointer to the actual workflow itself and points to all the custom pages or all the custom forms that specific workflow might be using. So XML file that points to all the dependencies and workflow itself. In fact, that is exactly what is deployed in SharePoint. We deploy a workflow template. Well, workflow template is deployed, but then somehow it needs to be associated with a specific list, document library, or just a content type. That is what is called association. And in fact, if you remember in the demo a few minutes ago, I had built a couple of associations. One was that interview guidelines review workflow. That was actually not a workflow itself. It was an association of approval workflow to that specific list. And I think the second example we built was the legal workflow. Again, it is not actually a workflow. It is an association named legal review. All the custom parameters for that specific list. But inside, that association is still using the approval workflow. So one list can have multiple associations. Sure. And again, list, document library, content type. And every single item, the actual workflow runs on items. So every single item can run through workflow. In fact, every single item can run through multiple workflows. But there is one catch, and the catch is one item can have only one workflow instance of a given association.
So for the example that I gave earlier, my document as it went through the interview guidelines workflow could only have gone through that process once. It couldn't go through it 4 concurrently, right? It could go in sequence, right? But it could have gone through the interview guidelines approval workflow and the legal review workflow at the same time, right? So with a particular association that you have, a particular item can only go through that via one instance.
Yep.
So if this is the architecture and how it's set up, and I think we related that to the demo, let's build some things. What does it take to build workflows beyond the ones that are out of the box?
Well, we actually have a couple of different options. One option is we can use SharePoint Designer. SharePoint Designer is a new version of Forum Page. And Forum Page is a very useful tool for many SharePoint-related tasks, including building workflows. And as we'll see in the demo in a few seconds, it is actually taking wizard-based approach, similar to what Outlook does if you decide to customize your inbox rules or outbox rules. That's exactly the same kind of conceptual idea that is happening in the SharePoint Designer. So one key point to remember is when you create your workflow in SharePoint Designer, you are actually not writing any code at all. None, zero. In fact, you build your workflow from pre-existing building blocks. We call them activities, right? And the good news is that building blocks is quite extensible. So your developers are quite welcome to add more custom actions and activities and even provide custom conditions. SharePoint Designer will be happy to use them as well. So let's see it. Yep. Okay, so what I have here is just expense report demo. So we will go through a scenario of expense report approval. And let's say our scenario is going to be quite simple. Somebody submits an expense report, and in fact, we will be using InfoPath form, sample InfoPath form that ships with InfoPath itself. InfoPath form will be submitted to a library called expense report. And then we start the workflow. We start the workflow and we take a look at the total amount of the expenses. And let's say the amount is, let's say, less than $75, we will automatically approve that expense. If it is more than 75, then we will ask Active Directory to figure out who is the manager of that person, ask him to make a decision on and review that expense report. And if the expense has been approved, finally, we'll move it to the approved expenses folder. So let's start. Here is the SharePoint Designer. If you haven't seen it before, you can probably recognize it does look quite similarly to what front page used to look like. So we go in File, New, Workflow. Called Expense Workflow. And one key point to remember here is that workflows designed in SharePoint Designer are always attached to one and only one list. So in our case, that document library happened to be called expense report. And we would like to start the workflow when there is a new item is in that new form is submitted. So we go next. And as you can see, it's actually quite simple wizard-based design approach. So we have a lot of different conditions we could use. And again, conditions list as well as action list is quite extensible. In fact, this is the complete list of actions we ship out of the box with one exception. Get manager from Active Directory is not registered, is not an action that's registered by default in SharePoint Designer. We actually ship that activity in the SDK, so if you like, you just compile that activity and easily deploy it to the server, and it will appear in this specific list as well. So all other activities are built in. Okay, so first condition. In fact, let's name this step, let's say check amount. Oops. And the condition is in our expense report field, if the total amount, it will be total field, is greater than, let's say, $75, then the first step is we get manager from Active Directory. Well, we need to get manager information for what user? Well, we will see for the user who has created the item. That specific activity has multiple output values. those output values will be automatically mapped to variables that will be created on the fly for the very first time. So you can probably see here, we use manager account name, email address, display name, and I think the success flag for getting manager information out of Active Directory. So now we know who the manager is. Let's ask them to approve the expense. So we'll use an activity called collect data. What data do we want to collect? Well, essentially what should be in that task. So we say review new expense report. Please review. Oops. And we would like to add one more field that the manager has to fill out. And it will be is approved expense. And the type of that field is going to be yes or no field, which is essentially Boolean. Indicate if approved. The default value will be no, so we don't approve any expenses by default. And what user would you like to create the task for? Well, now we know that we have that manager variable that holds the account name of the manager. We use workflow lookup. Use workflow data, and manager account name is the variable we would like to use. All right. So manager will now go and make a decision on that specific item. What is next? Next, we need to figure out what the decision is. So we need to create one more variable that will hold that information. Let's create a new variable, and it will be is approved. The type variable here is Boolean. And in fact, one more point on that collect activity. There is actually one output that goes to a variable happen to be named collect, and that contains a task ID. So manager will get a task and will make a decision using that task. So task ID, that list ID item, will be stored in the collect variable. So the next step is we set a workflow variable we just created called isApproved, and we set it to whatever is in the task list. So we point to task list. Here it is, tasks. And we are looking for isApproved expense field. Okay, but task list contains multiple different tasks. Which one we are looking for? So we are looking for one where task ID here it is. ID is equal to our collect variable. Again, collect variable contains an ID from the task creation step. Okay. So what we got so far, if the total expense is more than $75, we'll get manager information, we'll create a task for that manager, and we'll use a variable to hold the result. If that condition is not true, so if the amount is less than $75, then we would like to approve the expense automatically. Okay, and in fact, let's say that is all for right now. So we'll click finish. It will take one moment. So we go back to our list. Let's create a new expense item. Let's say it will be a hotel expense. a total amount of, let's say, $120. Save, submit. Done. So if you go back to this list, once it refreshes, you see that we have now workflow in progress. If you go and see what is going on inside of that workflow status, it looks like Bob Smith, who happened to be manager of the user I'm logged in as, has a new task, review expense report item. So we'll edit that item. And in fact, this is a custom ISPX page that we generate using SharePoint Designer. And in fact, when you create a workflow, that custom ISPX page is generated automatically. If you don't like it, let's change it. We don't need save draft and we don't need cancel buttons, so we'll change it in a second. So for now, the expense is approved. We refresh the screen here. The task is now complete. Going back to the expense report, the workflow is complete. We had one step in the workflow. Workflow is now done. So let's go back and see if we can add the second step. So in fact, if you notice, we have a new folder here called workflows. And our expense workflow happened to be right here. So the actual workflow file is a file with XOML extension. It contains XAML or just XML file. Let's see what it looks like inside. Oops. Just an XML. Okay. And we have a rules file. That's where the rules, in our case, if expense is less than $75, is stored. And in fact, we got one more ISPX page for that custom task we have created for our manager. And in a moment, you should see that page. In fact, let's switch to the design view. Takes a moment. And the point here is we will be able to adjust the page to apply specific design we would like to, maybe slightly accommodate different controls. That's what happens here. There is a slight disadvantage of running demo inside of virtual PC. Sometimes it might be slow. Okay, here it is. So let's just kill those buttons. And instead of complete task, let's say submit. Done, saved. Okay. So now let's go back to the workflow and add one more step. We are back in the wizard, so we'll add the second step. And the step is going to be, if the expense is approved, then we will copy it to a folder. Copy to the list, I'm sorry. Yep, copy expense. So the condition is compare date of any data source. We will be looking for the variable we just built. It will be is approved variable. So if the expense is approved, then we copy the existing item to approved expenses list. And we'll say done. Notice that I do not have to do any steps for deploying that workflow to the SharePoint list. As soon as I click finish, it is done. It happens live. All right, so let's go ahead and run one more test. A new expense. Let's say it will be car. Let's say it's an expensive car.
It's a pretty cheap car there.
Well, maybe just for one day. Again, the screen refreshes. Workflow is still in progress. Okay. If you notice, we got a new page. That's exactly what we just designed. Yep. We approve the expense. Refresh this page one more time. The task is completed. Workflow is completed here as well. And here's the approved expense library that contains that item, the copy of that item.
So you mentioned there were 2 tools.
Yes, and
that was one.
In fact, yes.
What was
yes.
the other one?
Yeah, well, let's quickly take a look at the Visual Studio. So the second tool, besides using SharePoint Designer, you can use Visual Studio to design your custom workflows. So the interface here is slightly different. It is actually somewhat more visual. And the list of available activities here is quite substantial. Now again, those activities are shipped with SharePoint SDK. You are quite welcome to create your own activities and make it available in that list. There is no problem doing so at all. And the one item to keep here, to keep in mind here is in Visual Studio, you are writing some code. So that's the main difference between, one of the differences between using Visual Studio and using SharePoint Designer.
So how do you decide which one?
Excellent question. Let's switch to the slides. So we put a lot of most of the decision points here. Just would like to highlight a few of them. The development model is again wizard-based in SharePoint Designer and is much more graphical in Visual Studio. You cannot, I stress again, you cannot write custom code using SharePoint Designer approach, but you can using Visual Studio. In SharePoint Designer, you use the safe list of pre-built activities that we ship or your developers have customized. And Visual Studio, it's a complete developer tool. So when it comes to deployment, in SharePoint Designer, you click Finish, your workflow is now live. In Visual Studio, you can build a package or a feature in SharePoint and deploy it to as many servers as you like, to your development server, your test server, and so on, so on, so on. So those are some of the major differences.
Okay, let's a few tidbits about administration and some of the history reporting. We're going to do most of this in the demo, so I'm going to go through the slides quite quickly. One of the things that Alex mentioned that's pretty important is the significant difference in deployment models. Mainly, if you're building workflows in Visual Studio, when you're deploying those, first they're reusable in multiple site collections, and when they're deployed as features. And as we're going to see in the demo, that has your ability to go in and turn them on and turn them off in different places. And we'll go through some of these other options. And you've seen some of this already, but I'll highlight it again in terms of tracking and reporting and what your capabilities are around that history list and how to get data out. And the one point that I want to make sure I remember to say, so I'll say it twice, you should not view history tracking as a security feature. And I'll show you at the end of this demo how, if you have not locked that down, how it's easily editable and people can change what happened in the past. So let's switch back to the laptop. So here's the site that I was running earlier. So if I go in as a site administrator now and I'm interested in controlling what workflows are available and what ones aren't, the very first place I want to draw your attention to is the Site Collection Features area. And if I click in here, features, which is a longer talk that I have in a session on Thursday, the features are much bigger than workflow. But when workflows get deployed, they get deployed as site collection level features. There's a scope to them. So any site collection administrator goes in, they're going to see those features here. When the feature's deployed, if you haven't activated anywhere, no one's using your workflow. Right? Not until they come in and say, well, I'm going to activate the job openings workflow, and now that workflow template becomes available for associations to be built. What other things can you do at the site collection level? Well, I can go into a workflow gallery and see what workflow templates are available, how many associations are there, and how many instances are in progress. Notice your SharePoint Designer workflows don't get displayed here. Right? Your SharePoint Designer workflows are particular to a list. They're built in the live environment. They live there. At the individual list itself, remember you could go in and effectively turn on and off different workflows by building different associations. There's also an option in central administration that's like the big easy button, right? You can hit it and not allow custom workflows to be built at all. Right? So there's that one bit value that you can turn on or off depending upon your situation, whether you want to make that type of activity available. You can also in central administration control how external participants should interact with the workflow. And by external participant, I mean people who would normally not ever have access to your site. So there's an option where if we turn that on, we can have send an email that a task needs to happen, right, to someone who's outside of your environment, and someone internally is associated with them. So they do their work completely outside the environment, send an email back to that person saying, yeah, it looks good, and they're responsible for entering it into the system. So that's what that definition of external participant is about. Of course, as I showed you earlier, if I go into this screen here, I can not click on Jane Doe, sorry. Go in and see that history log. Again, this is just a list. There's nothing special about it, except that when you build the associations, they get created. You can have more than one workflow use this. In all practicality, it's more useful to divide those things up so that you have audit data about a particular workflow together. The interface, if you do store them in more than one, will accommodate. It'll display the right history information for that workflow instance. But sometimes for reporting capability, it's better to have them separate. Notice the option to run reports from this. These reports are Excel-based. And this is also another area of extension for a developer to go in and build new reports. There are a few in the SDK, and I believe you'll see them in the 400 level session later. But you can go in here and run a report which dumps that history list data into Excel and displays it for you to be able to filter it and chart off of it and all of that. So if I run an activity duration report for my interview guidelines, approval process we saw earlier, so this is the interface Excel anticipates that I'm interested in. How much time in terms of hours is it taking to do these things? Notice on the second tab here, I have all of the raw data. So any report that you would want to build from this that allows you to filter, sort, chart, anything else is available from this particular point. Now, I mentioned a key point that the history list is not secure, and your users should be pretty good at guessing URLs in SharePoint by now. So they would never see this link directly, but if they knew it would happen to have been called workflow history, which they are by default, right? I could guess the URL, and if I had not secured that history list and users had edit rights to most things, notice I edit this in a data sheet, pulls up the lovely little access view here, and now I have edit rights. So let's go back in the past. It wasn't Bob that was asked to participate in that. It was Bobby, right? And I can change what happened in the past. So a history list should not be viewed as security. So again, just a few tidbits in terms of administration. So just to kind of start wrapping up, well, we are going to do a Q&A, but we want to make sure before everyone gets up and leaves that we highlight some of the other related content at DECAD. So I'll come back to that slide. There is a 400 level session that goes much deeper into the Visual Studio experience. We tried to keep this at a high level. It was 200, kind of out of the box. But if you're interested in building those custom activities, what can you do in Visual Studio that you can't do in SharePoint Designer, there's a 400 level session on Thursday that does that in particular. There's also an architecture one that talks in a little bit more detail about that spectrum that I talked about earlier and when to use BizTalk, SharePoint, Windows Workflow Foundation by itself, etc. If you want to try these types of things on your own, there's both an instructors-led lab as well as a hands-on lab. And one more piece of related content.
And there are multiple books. Multiple books are available in SharePoint, around SharePoint and SharePoint-related technologies. And the book on the left is a very specific book around how you're going to build custom workflows. Very, very useful, highly recommended. And the second book is slightly more generic book about any custom development in SharePoint as well.
All right, so we have a few minutes for questions. We deliberately did that. Again, please come up to the microphone so the people over live meeting can hear. And if there happens to be a long line, we will take some more questions down at the TLC area, that green area of office near lunch.
Yes, please.
We were about ready. I have a quick question about the default for the publishing portal is that it is a parallel approval. Is there any way to set up a standard default workflow, and then have site collections inherit it down the path, if that makes sense? In other words, set it up as serial, not just approvers, but these people, and then it's going to be 3 days. You set it once, and then all the lists and libraries get it?
Because of the mic, I couldn't hear the beginning of the question, so I'm sorry.
How do you set a default approval process on a site collection so that all the subsites inherit it? So, for example, rather than choosing parallel approval, you choose serial approval with these two groups. That's going to take 3 days.
Okay, so are you meaning so that you want to make sure that your sites in the libraries and its collections have...
Exactly. Rather than going individually to each one and change it on each one, you set it at one level and it just flows down.
Right, so there are a few options. It depends upon what you have in terms of site definition to be able to do, whether it's a custom site definition or one that's out of the box. If it's probably makes more sense to talk about if it's one that's out of the box, right? When the sites get created, you can have what's called a feature stapler, so a way to run code in a way to tie in a new feature to that site as it gets provisioned. Right, and since it's your own custom feature, you can then write your own code. You have the opportunity to set up what other custom features should be enabled. You can access different libraries, different lists, and set up different default settings there. So if it's out of the box, which is more complicated, if it's your own site definition, you can do a lot of that work in the onet.xml file. But if it's one that's not, there's a technique called feature stapling, which in our 400-level features and templates session on Thursday, we'll go into more detail.
Can you only do that when you're creating the new site collection, or can you add it after?
Yeah, so the feature stapling technique is for new sites that get provisioned. Anything afterwards is probably going to be scripted of activating features. So somewhere else around the room, I think you were.
Mm-hmm. We were looking to roll out SharePoint 2007 soon, and looking at the feature set, there are just so many features available. Are we opening up a floodgate of support concerns with the workflow? Have you found that it's easy enough for users to use? They don't turn around and start asking the support staff and the help desk questions about it?
Yeah, so, and there's a very big generic question in addition to workflows in particular, in that, because you would also make the same argument, about my sites, or my site's more complicated than portal pages, right? And so just from a rollout strategy, it's usually not one where you give the users everything out of the gate, right? You tend to ramp up in terms of functionality, and the order that you pick and choose is going to be more dependent upon what's needed for your particular processes, right? So, for example, just to use my sites as an example, it might be the case where an organization populates the profiles directory, but doesn't let users know that they have my sites in order to get some functionality, but not a lot of it, until they're used to regular old team sites. You can take the same approach with workflow, in that not allowing custom workflows to be built and only allowing ones that are part of the organization, right, that are documented and kind of already present, and then over time opening it up so that users have more flexibility to do their own ad hocness. So every organization is different, and we see a lot of customers, and certainly there's a spectrum there, but something along those lines.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Do you have a case study that's gone out where the examples are not so trivial, where perhaps at least 100 workflows have been completed, and those workflows have some intensity to them, some branching, some special reporting, because this is a fairly new product, right? Yeah. Do you have any of those case studies so that we know, hey, this has gone through a couple requirements iterations,
yeah,
in a real case?
So I know there are a lot of case studies. Knowing a URL off the top of my head is not something I'm going to be able to refer you to, but I know that one place to start is Microsoft's IT Showcase, which, the best case study is how first did we roll it out ourselves. in terms of the capability we gave our users and what did we see happening, and then there'll be references off of that for people who are external customers that have bought into it. The one thing that I'll add is remember that we're very focused on a particular scenario here and a particular vision of document-centric workflows. They tend to be things that are not 100 steps. I mean, you can certainly write a workflow that does that, but there's also value in the game for having dedicated server products that, again, still build off of Windows Workflow Foundation that even add more capability. And that's where you see partners filling space like K2, Capteris, and some of those others. This doesn't necessarily replace that. They're using the same engine we are, but they're adding a more capability for something that you might be hinting at in terms of the complexity that
yes,
you're
I'm not saying 100 steps. I'm saying a 10-step process that's been done at least 100 times.
Yeah. And again, every process is kind of different. Yes, there are case studies.
Okay.
I start with IT Showcase, but I wanted to also add, in case the hint of complexity was there, and it not really is complexity, but enterpriseness, don't eliminate looking at to see what Microsoft's partners also add on top of our stack.
Okay.
So let's do this side of the room.
I have a couple of questions. One would be, is there any way we can control the timeout on these workflows? Like you have a timeout?
Yes. So not directly controlling the timeout, but in fact you can have what has been known as listen activity, where you say, I would like to receive some event, let's say a task completion in 3 days or X. So such kind of activity is built in one of the built-in activities in WSS. So yes, you can control timeout using that technique.
But you can do it only programmatically, right? So is there a way in SharePoint Designer that I can do that?
So meaning that you have to explicitly include that activity in the workflow.
Oh, okay.
Yes, I believe so.
Okay. And the other question would be, how do you communicate between workflows?
If you build custom workflows, you will actually have options for workflows to talk to any external entities and build custom interfaces for it.
Yeah, there's like a strongly coupled way to do that and a kind of a loosely coupled way to do that, whether you're really having workflow instance talk to workflow instance at an object layer. We also see a lot of implementations that are much more soft than that. For example, we might have a workflow in one site collection that creates a new instance and a new item in another site collection that triggers a different workflow. And in that case, the workflows really aren't talking, but one is causing the other one to start.
Okay.
Right? We could talk a little bit more about that. I want to make sure other people have the time to answer some questions. Let's go back over here on this side.
Yep.
We'll get you next.
You had showed the example of the out-of-the-box workflow. In the out-of-the-box workflow, there was a really nice-looking approval form. And then when you did the designer one, it had kind of the less nice-looking form. And both of those are somewhat out of the box by default with each of their own types of workflow. But is there a way, if you create a SharePoint designer workflow, to get the form that's from the out-of-the-box approval? Because it's a much nicer form, you know what I'm saying?
So if I may rephrase the question, can you reuse some of the forms out of box for your custom workflows? And unfortunately, the answer is no.
Hey.
You can, if you really want to try, you can figure out how exactly those forms are built, and it is actually explained very, very nicely again in the SharePoint SDK. Okay. What parameters are passed to those forms, and potentially you might be able to pass the same kind of parameters that will be pointing to your custom workflows. And that way, yes, you might be able to reuse it, but it is not very easy.
Yeah, well, one point that was made very subtly in our example is that when we work with users or customers that are very particular about the forms themselves, we tend to rely on InfoPath and form services and design those where you have more of an editor that would support form.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, he's been waiting that we'll come back up to here.
Is there any built-in support for escalation, or is that something that you have to kind of design yourself?
Built-in support for escalation is the question.
You mean for out-of-box workflows or in general?
In general.
So in general, that is done using a listen activity, which is essentially I would like to listen to, and listen in that case implies receive an event from about a specific task completion within X days, and if that doesn't happen, do X. Okay. So that support is built in, yes. You can just use appropriate activity.
Now you'd still have to decide what you want to do as part of the escalation. right?
I want to deploy the workflow using Visual Studio, and can I use a web part or ASP.NET interface because we don't have the form server license?
Absolutely. Yes, you can build any kind of forms, and you don't have to be InfoPath related forms. Can be custom ASP.NET forms, or can be ASP.NET forms or web parts, whatever you like. Yes, you are completely flexible. We are completely flexible, and you can do whatever you like.
Is any book which particularly talk about Visual Studio and the SharePoint?
No, we only support, well, we mostly support custom forms for Visual Studio scenario. If you noticed, I made some changes when we did the demo to the form that was generated on the fly. So it depends on what kind of changes. But unfortunately, you cannot just take that form away and replace it with your complete custom form if you rely on SharePoint Designer. Built-in forms are probably the best option at that point.
Okay. Sir?
Thanks. Is SharePoint Designer, with SharePoint Designer, is it strictly used just for forms development for SharePoint, or can it be used to, the old front page functionality, like create websites from scratch and manage websites, or even like design web parts?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of other functionality there that we're not focused on. Our session was kind of exclusively
so
within
just
the workflow
forms
boundary.
for us, all right.
Yeah, and it's one of those things of, as a SharePoint developer, I really didn't like the front page 2003, whatever, in the past. But there are tasks that I now use SharePoint Designer for. And one of the ones that's kind of the hottest item for me that really adds value is building the master pages and the page layouts for the web content management sites. So there's even more than was there previously because the product's been honed and targeted specifically to SharePoint. That's why it's called SharePoint Designer. Right. So it did a lot of the things that it did in the past, and in a lot of cases does them better. The whole ghosting, unghosting, customized pages is much better because now if you do customize a page, it will tell you that and give you the ability to revert back to the one that's based on the site definition. So there is a lot there. We're showing a very narrow capability.
Well,
I have a question about the history list and the task list. Can you make reference to a list that is in a top level site collection? Instead of using the one, in the moment that you create the workflow, you have the option of selecting, right?
Yeah, but it's only going to show you the lists that are in the current site.
Within the site?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you.
Just a brief question. The workflows will work in any kind of site? I mean, even public-facing sites?
Yeah, it's not limited to the deployment model that you've selected, right? And so you could be building these things in WSS in a hosted manner or an internet-facing MOS site, any of the deployment scenarios workflow would support. In fact, the web content management functionality, which people mostly think of as an external site, the publishing process of how it goes from author to reviewer to being published on the page is a workflow as well.
Do you have a question?
Okay.
A follow-up question to the previous one. Do you have any way to aggregate all these lists at a higher level? Let's say if you have someone that needs to see all the approval process at a higher level on a site collection. Do you have any way to aggregate all these to-do lists and history list?
So they are lists themselves, right? So there are no web part out of the box is coming to mind, but there are vendors that do aggregate up. The other option, of course, is as the workflow runs to have it writing things to a list that's centrally as well, that you then might have KPIs or things like that built off of for MOS. But there's no sense of like an inherent roll-up. You have to have a web part that facilitates that.
Okay.
So if there are any more questions, we'll take them down in the lounge or as we're closing up here. We forgot to mention it in our bad, but for those of you who bothered to stay around, the evals would be nice.